All right, Secretary Pompeo, it is such a pleasure to sit down with you. Thank you so much for chatting with me. How are things going here at Hudson Institute?
Going great. Good to be with you. I'm looking forward to the conversation. It's been a special place to be able to work and be with some really smart people and writing some things that are important about what's going on in the world today and making sure that we continue to secure America's freedom.
Right, and you just returned from a trip to Israel. How was that?
It's a great trip. I'd gone there for the special occasion that was my friend, the director of Mossad, now former director of Mossad, Yossi Cohen's retirement party. But we also had a bunch of friends there that we hadn't seen in a long time. And so we got a chance to spend the weekend there and then attend the retirement ceremony and speak and thank the Prime Minister and Director Cohen for the great work they did to secure America. We were great partners and friends. We built out this deep, important relationship between the United States and Israel. And I promise you that the Iranians are well aware of the good work that we all did.
Indeed, but unfortunately, it seems like all the good that was done under the Trump administration seems to be unraveling. Your successor seems to be kind of all over the place with policy. They're not really exhibiting peace through strength. What has been your impression of Secretary Blinken's performance so far, you would say?
Well, it's still early. And in the end, presidents drive the policy decision. So it's President Biden that will ultimately be responsible for the policy decisions that the administration makes. They've had some good rhetoric on China, but I haven't seen any follow through yet. And in the Middle East, it's the same cast of characters from the previous 8 years. They're headed back down the same path with respect to Iran that will guarantee them a pathway to a nuclear weapon. I hope that they'll live up to what they said about the Abraham Accords and continue to build out on it. But when you underwrite the Palestinians by providing assistance to them, knowing full well that it'll end up in the hands of terrorists, when you sit in Vienna with the Iranians while the Iranians are funding Hamas, firing rockets from Gaza into Tel Aviv and into Jerusalem, that demonstrates to countries all across the world that the United States has radically changed its model of deterrence. And I promise you that the Ayatollah is watching that closely as well.
And a country that actually is really aligned with Iran is Russia. And during the campaign, we heard now President Biden talk about how he's going to be tough on Russia, he's going to stand up to Vladimir Putin. And one of the first things he does is waive Nord Stream 2 sanctions, which was a priority under your tenure when you were Secretary of State. And it seems just to be mostly all bark, no bite. With respect to Russia, with the Belarusian incident that happened in going towards the Lithuanian airspace with the Belarusian dissident. Could you explain and maybe refresh for my viewers and listeners, what was the Trump doctrine with respect to Russia? Because we heard that your boss was an asset of Vladimir Putin, and anyone who has been consistently critical of the Kremlin may actually see that the actions didn't point to that direction. So remind everyone what exactly you guys did.
Yeah, it's one of the craziest things. I mean, we literally had a hoax foisted upon the American people. I don't think anybody buys the Steele dossier story anymore. We've watched the left-wing media from the Times to the Washington Post have to walk away from a great deal of their reporting. They do it sub rosa. They don't do it by being honest about the failure of their journalistic processes. But all that while, right, you had Congressman Adam Schiff and Democrat leaders talking about Russia, 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 and look at the policies. Look at the work that we did and compare it just to the first now 130 days or so of the Biden administration. We put defensive weapon systems in the hands of the Ukrainians. We built out an arsenal of American democracy that can't make Vladimir Putin happy when we raise defense budgets. The list of actions that we took, sanctions on senior leaders, you talked about the pipeline. The Russians want to build a pipeline so the Germans will be dependent upon them in times of trouble. We prevented that from being concluded. This administration stopped only one pipeline, one in the United States, not Nord Stream 2. I mean, that is just crazy. Don't forget, too, the very first action that this administration took with respect to Russia was to rejoin a treaty, the New START treaty, which we had made the decision we wanted to talk to the Russians some more. They re-entered that treaty, much to Vladimir Putin's joy, in exchange for nothing. They demanded literally nothing. They just walked back in and said, yep, we're going to extend it for 5 years. We had laid the groundwork. We'd had discussions with the Russians. We'd had discussions with the Chinese, trying to convince them that we were happy to enter into nuclear arrangements where we had shared interests, but that it was going to have to make sense for the United States, and yet they walked in and handed Vladimir Putin a gift almost on the first day of the administration. You've gone through the list. I would tell you that it is not a close call. who was tougher with respect to taking on the interests of Russia most seriously, who was prepared to work with Russia when it made sense, but all the nonsense, all the noise that our administration suffered for a couple years from so many people who were foisting a story on the world about American weakness in the face of Vladimir Putin, I think they can now see the contrast pretty sharply, and I think it redounds to the benefit of President Trump and the work that we did.
Do you worry that our allies in Eastern Europe are going to feel betrayed? And what are your thoughts also on Biden's forthcoming summit with Vladimir Putin? He says he's going to talk about Putin trying to pursue human rights. I think that's going to fall on deaf ears. What are your thoughts on that?
Talk is cheap. Handshakes don't replace interests. In the end, what matters is the outcomes that one gets. I remember when we met with Chairman Kim, people said, "Oh, the president should meet with him." We met and had these conversations because we were trying to deliver good outcomes. We ought not be rewarded for the conversation, but for what we're able to deliver. And I'd say the same thing about President Biden in his meeting with Vladimir Putin. If he can get a good outcome for the United States of America, if they can find places where there are overlapping interests, where we can figure out how to work together on a particular problem set, how we can separate the Russians from the Chinese Communist Party, I think those would all be good. But it's going to need resolve. It's going to need force and determination from a president who, to date, hasn't shown the capacity to deliver that on behalf of the American people.
Something that I think critics of the current president can surmise from his actions, what he is doing for Russia is he's helping Russia build back better with respect to energy. I wanted to ask you about energy and the environment. And actually, if you don't mind me asking about this tweet that's kind of generated some interest among reporters and other commentators. You had tweeted recently, "If you stand for climate change first, you stand for America last." Could you elaborate why you tweeted that?
Yeah, so here's the deal. Former Secretary Kerry is driving the central thesis of this administration's foreign policy. Ours was America first. We were unambiguous. When I met with my counterparts around the world, it was pretty clear. Mike Pompeo showed up to make sure Americans were more prosperous and more secure and safer. When this administration has these conversations, if the other side will offer them a little bit of a carbon reduction, or worse yet, a promise of some future carbon reduction, kind of like a Wimpy's Burger tomorrow, these folks are willing to trade things that matter, the security interests that matter to the American people. So my comments were, we all want clean air, we all want safe drinking water, but to hand over the American economy, to bust the American worker, to get the Green New Deal done on the back of the American worker, does indeed put America behind the interests of other countries. And Secretary Kerry, inside this administration, inside whether it's our discussions with the Chinese or the Russians or the Europeans, the totem, the Green New Deal totem ranks first among many, and I think will really put America at risk in so many places when we prioritize this deal where only America will live up to its promises. It's not good. It's not good for American security.
Right, because China is a far greater polluter than us, and they're not going to be doing anything until some arbitrary deadline, 2030.
Not a chance that the Chinese Communist Party is going to sacrifice their economy on the altar of a religious act of Green New Deal promises 20, 40, 60 years from now. I can prove that. They've made these promises before and they have broken them, and there's no reason to believe that Xi Jinping would ever sacrifice economic growth or military power in order to satisfy some political constituency. It's just not in the cards.
Under President Trump, this country for the first time ever became energy independent. It's because we had a system in place, I believe, that advocated for true conservation, where you could have stewardship, but also some preservation. You could have people working without obviously tanking the economy. And we see with different efforts, obviously revoking the Keystone Pipeline, and most recently with ANWR being stalled. That's certainly going to have an impact on energy, and energy, I think, in your mind, is a national security issue. So what are your impressions of President Biden's push to move away from kind of this balanced use approach with energy security to capitulating essentially to our foreign adversaries? Essentially, they get to be energy independent, they get to make all this money, and then we get to suffer simultaneously, and not really at the interest of the environment either. We're losing in both of these cases.
So I'm from Kansas, an energy producing state. We knew that we needed to keep the land clean. We knew we needed to protect these resources. There was nothing like our farmers and ranchers and our energy producers to know that the environment mattered to them and to their families and their grandkids. But we've got to produce. Gabriella, I must say, I met with dozens and dozens of foreign leaders over months and months. There were very few meetings where energy wasn't top of mind for my foreign counterpart, whether it was the president or the prime minister or my counterpart, the foreign minister. They all knew they had to turn the lights on. They all knew that they needed to provide energy for transportation. They knew that if they were going to feed their people, they needed manufacturing that was energy intensive. And they wanted to do it in a clean way. They wanted American natural gas. They wanted American resources that came from the cleanest producers in the world. And now the president is choosing to shut that all down. It'll be incredibly destructive to the American economy. It will raise energy costs. You can already begin to see it at the gasoline pumps. You'll start to see it in electrical bills as well as natural gas becomes more expensive, harder to get at. That may take a little bit of time, but these effects are real and they occur over time. But importantly, though, we'll risk American national security as well. I much prefer our friends to get energy from the United States than to have to turn to our adversaries, whether that's from Russia or someplace else in the world. It was an important tool in the American diplomatic kit to have energy independence and the capacity to export this energy around the world and the technology that we had developed alongside of it. And it looks like we're about to throw it all away.
Because the president has a refusal of wanting to do domestic mining. He still is going to lean, I think a lot of the proposals are to have electric vehicles that still rely on materials from China and other countries. So his refusal to do that here because he's beholden to certain interests certainly complicates matters for his so-called clean energy plan. I wanted to ask more so broadly before I move to some other topics, what energy kind of sources do you see as being sustainable? Should we keep an all of the above approach? Should we pursue nuclear more? That's something that the new White House climate advisors are nixing altogether. They don't want to have carbon capture. But what do you see as in our future, what should be pursued?
Yeah, we should let 1,000 flowers bloom and we ought not subsidize any of them. Look, sign me up for solar panels, happy to have wind turbines, but the American people have to be able to afford this energy. We have to actually be able to grow the American economy. It can't be the case that you can pull the most affordable, indeed some of the cleanest energy sources out of the marketplace and not understand that you're going to drive inflation, drive price increases all across the American economy. I'd be happy to see us come up with a set of policies that permit nuclear to flourish again. We've abandoned that. It can be done safely. It's enormously clean. I think that would be a welcome energy generation, which would satisfy those on the left who desire immediate and great decreases in carbon emissions. You mentioned carbon capture. That technology is technology that was originally developed in the United States. It's pretty remarkable. Still not quite market efficient, but getting closer. We ought to allow technologists and innovators, just like we did with fracking, to lead the way and drive down energy costs, drive up energy efficiency, and we'll get the environment that we want, and we'll get that environment with an economy that will allow America to continue to be the most innovative, creative, growing economy in the world.
You're very passionate about the Second Amendment. I saw that you did a video recently talking about it. You've been consistently in support of it since your time in Congress as well. What policies specifically from the Biden administration concern you, and what are your thoughts on the ATF director nominee, David Chipman?
Yeah, the most concerning policy was the choice of Mr. Chipman. His track record on these set of issues, the things that he has said, suggest that he doesn't believe that the Second Amendment actually holds true across a broad range. We saw him talk about assault rifles in a way that can only be described as ignorant. I don't mean that meanly, just an absence of knowledge. Someone ought to teach him. He's got a very important job now. What it really means, what the Second Amendment really means. Look, this is something that's been I've worked on since even before I was a member of Congress. My wife and I both had concealed carry permits back in the day in Kansas. We love to go out with our son. It's something our family did down at the farm in Winfield, Kansas. He's a better shooter than I am, but I'm gonna catch him. The old eyes are catching up with me a little bit. Look, our founders understood that this mattered. The capacity for Americans to keep and bear arms was something that they thought was so central that they put it in that very Second Amendment.
It seems like Biden's agenda is going kind of in conflict with just the surge of new gun owners in this country.
Yeah.
I think today's statistics, as of our recording, I think there have been 8.5 million guns sold this year. I think 1.3 million upwards of whatever. But more people are buying guns. So it seems like his agenda runs counter to kind of where the public opinion is going, where Americans are looking to. How can he reconcile pushing this agenda and ignoring the will of his constituents?
Yeah. I don't think it's very politically popular, but even that aside, it runs against the grain of what our founders understood America was all about, and so even were it the case that it was popular, it's not permissible. And I hope our courts will find some of the things that I suspect they will attempt to do. We've seen this before with assault rifles and various efforts to regulate guns, or even in the worst, most egregious cases, try to confiscate guns, make it prohibitive for people to keep them. I hope our courts will continue to protect and preserve this right. Your point about firearms being purchased, what's happening in our cities today across America, it saddens me. There's not a Monday morning you wake up and don't read about shooting deaths in Chicago and New York City shootings in our big urban cores. This is where the administration should focus. This is if you want to protect the American people, these are the places that we need mayors who are serious about protecting their own people, funding police, making sure they have the resources they need, defending them when they come under threats that are inappropriate for the actions that they have taken. Trying to eliminate firearms in violation of the Second Amendment isn't going to protect often kids that live in very difficult circumstances in the inner cities. It's not going to protect them. A strong Second Amendment and strong support of our men in blue, that'll protect them.
I wanted to ask you about the $6 trillion budget briefly that President Biden has proposed. And something I think that is kind of getting lost in the news cycle is the elimination of the Hyde Amendment too. What are the implications of the budget overall, and then also with its exclusion?
So that's really important. You're right, it hasn't gotten enough attention. For an awfully long time, the Hyde Amendment has been something that everyone has accepted as normative. All the fights about protecting the unborn that we have in the United States, everyone has acknowledged that taxpayer money ought not go to underwrite abortions, not ought to pay for a single abortion. We, in the Trump administration, made that very clear domestically. I worked on this around the world as well, making sure that taxpayer money didn't go to fund abortions in places outside of the United States. We were focused, we were determined to protect every unborn person in every way that we possibly could. And to now watch the president put a budget out that will eliminate the Hyde Amendment, something that he had supported for most of his life, tells you, frankly, what's driving this administration. It tells you how far left they have moved on some of these issues that, frankly, are an American consensus position. It's sad. As for the $6 trillion, that's a big number. I'm not sure that too many folks that are watching this or listening to this could tell you exactly what $6 trillion is. But I can tell you, when you just uncover just the first few pages of this, you can see that this isn't about American growth. It's not about American greatness. It is a budget aimed at making us more socialist, more like Europe, with a big state apparatus, more people dependent on the United States government for their livelihood, fewer people who have the capacity to go work and earn a living for their families. These things matter to ordinary Americans all across America, and spending $6 trillion. Frankly, I'm old enough now, it may not impact my life a great deal, but my son, and I pray someday we'll have grandchildren, this will impact them an awful lot. And I hope that Republicans, and frankly Democrats, mainstream Democrats too, come to their senses and recognize you can't continue to spend money at this prolific pace and hope that the American economy will grow under that kind of a debt burden.
As someone who formerly started a business and ran a business, I wanted to ask you something about an issue that I think Republicans should talk about more, and it's related to the PRO Act. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's the biggest overhaul of labor in the United States. It would eliminate right-to-work states. It would essentially destroy self-employment and freelancing as we know it. That employs about a third of the economy, 36%. Sure. What do you see the implications resulting from that as? Because that's something we have not seen before. And this is an issue that supersedes politics. You see Democrats, not so much those in national office opposing this, but you see Democrats on the ground who are wholly opposed to this. They feel that they're not being heard from their party. What are some implications from that, if you have studied a little bit of it, and why should we oppose that?
Yeah, I know the top line pieces of this. I was from Kansas, a place where right to work was an essential part of what we did. There were places we had unions, so be it. But every American had the chance to do what they wanted to do. They weren't forced to join these unions. Their employers weren't forced to behave in a way that, frankly, was collectiveness, not individual, in the greatest traditions of the United States. The left has long wanted action just like this to deny states the right to be right-to-work states, I'm convinced that the American people don't want that. This issue of employees and independent contractors and freelancers, if you look at American history, most of the businesses that have generated so much prosperity and so much greatness started really small. The two that I started were both really tiny businesses in the grand scheme of thing. And one of the great things was we would always have people who would come join us. They'd work with us for a couple, 3 years, and then they'd go out and start a company of their own. It was awesome. We hated to lose them, but when someone wanted to go out and raise money and take risk and build out their own little company, this was glorious. We shouldn't put policies in place that punish that innovation. You said it's a third. I'll bet it's more than half of American innovation happens in the tiniest of businesses. Young men, young women who are out prepared to take real risks at a time in their life when they can afford to do so, and they'll lead to the great next thing here in the United States. You don't know what it is, I don't know what it is, but if we squelch that, if we put rules in place that make that difficult, only these big, huge, massive corporations will have the capacity to grow. And as entities grow, their capacity to innovate is reduced. It's almost a truism without exception. I hope that American innovation will continue to reside in these little places.
Do you think, speaking of corporations, we see a lot of blowback starting to happen towards corporate interests, social corporate welfare policies, or social corporate responsibility policies more broadly, are not starting to be positively received by the American public? What should Americans do to, I guess, teach them a lesson or probably prove their point to show that maybe they should stay out of politics going forward?
Yeah. Well, look, we know a couple things. When big companies talk about corporate responsibility or ESG, environmental programs, this about left politics almost always. That these aren't about policies that matter for workers. They're not about policies that matter for middle-class, hardworking Americans. They're policies that some group of elites, probably on the coast, have been able to convince the board of directors that it's in their best interest. I come back to this. There's not a single Republican that I've ever encountered that didn't want to have a safe workplace, that didn't want to have environments that workers could thrive and learn and grow and take care of their families. But when these companies enact policies that are ephemeral and often do it out of ignorance, right? We saw what happened with down in Georgia. We want people to be able to vote. The laws in Georgia are less restrictive than the ones in New York, and yet somehow we get caught up, corporate America gets caught up in this moment, and we move an all-star game and threaten the economy of Georgia because of some absence of understanding or because of some political extortion being applied against these companies. We shouldn't let the left shake down corporate America. Corporations are designed to treat their employees well and return value to their shareholders. That's the mission statement. To the extent they are focused on that and focused on that to the near exclusion of everything else, it's all to the better.
I want to conclude by asking you kind of about the future of the conservative movement, what your thoughts are about the movement going forward, electorally, culturally, things of that sort. We see some people, I think they're kind of like 3 or 4 diverging kind of philosophies in the movement or movements, but we also see people want to reimagine conservatism, not by what has worked. I think some people are twisting Trump's agenda, former President Trump's agenda, to be exclusionary, restrictionist, some elements, I would say, of national populism or conservative populism are not being framed in a positive light, and it's being perceived as very exclusionary. And then some people say we have to abandon Reaganism or we have to abandon the old conservative kind of philosophy. Where do you stand on that, and what role do you hope to play in the conservative movement going forward?
Well, I've been part of this for a long time now, and it is not new that there are divergent ideas inside of the Republican Party and inside of conservative thought. The strands of conservative thought are many, but what do they all gather around? Where's the consensus? It's not about groups or races, it's about individuals. It's not about big government, it's about small things, family, communities, our churches, people of faith. Those are the central animating principles. There'll be lots of debate about how best to execute them and whether one candidate has it better than the other. But those central themes about ordered liberty, about the traditional values of the United States, the very things that if you just grabbed your copy of the Federalist Papers and went back and read it, Those are the things that the party can never walk away from. When we do, we lose. When we do, we risk becoming more like the party that wants big government and command and control and to get inside of people's lives. That ordered liberty is at the center of the Republican Party when it is at its best, and it's at its best in the conservative movement each and every day. I don't know where I'll play a role, but I've been in this fight for a long time. I intend to stay at it for a little while longer, so long as the good Lord gives me a place to do it, and we'll see what happens. I'm out working hard to make sure that in 2022, President Biden has as short a runway as we can give him to have control of both houses of Congress. I'll be in Pennsylvania and then Wisconsin next week campaigning for candidates, helping them raise money and get ready to do battle against their liberal opponents. I'm convinced that these fights inside of our party, we'll iron our way through them. We'll be successful in 2022, and then I hope are enormously successful at regaining what I believe it is that Americans have wanted from time that our nation was founded. They want to be left alone. They want to raise their families. They want the capacity to work and learn and pass on to their children things that are better. I don't believe for a second that America is in decline. I don't think most Americans believe that. And our party needs to make sure it's very clear. We believe America is an exceptional nation and will remain so. And we need to do everything we can to make sure that it remains that way forever.
And you believe President Trump is going to continue to play a role? Because there are some people who say he shouldn't play a role. Some other potential people maybe trying to re-emerge into the scene. What role do you think President Trump is going to have?
Oh, I think he'll play whatever role President Trump chooses. He gets to decide. It's what's great about America. But the ideas that he brought forward, the very things that we've talked about for most of this conversation that I worked on for 4 years, first as CIA director and then as Secretary of State, those ideas were very popular across broad swaths of America, not just inside the Republican Party. It saddens me when I hear people talk about America alone. We found our place in the world as real leaders for the 4 years that I served in the national security team of the president. I'm convinced that those are the right ideas that will preserve America. And then we saw the great work that happened here at home. Right, we had an economy that was thriving. The Chinese then foisted this Wuhan virus upon the United States, and we intentionally shut down our economy. The policies that we had for these 4 years were good. We never got it perfect. No one ever does and perfectly right every day, but they were really good. And when I say good, they were good for the American people, for ordinary Americans who wanted that next opportunity in life. They were really good policies, and I'm convinced this is where our party will flourish.
Where can people connect with you and follow your musings, Secretary Pompeo?
So my best place to go today is on my Twitter account, at Mike Pompeo. I'm pretty active there, and I let people know what I think.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Gabriella, thanks for being with me.